This is my experience of the great outdoors and my time in EOE 224, as told by me, Cody White. So, I learned a lot from this class, lots of positives, lots of negatives. I learned about identity and the way I feel about outdoor education. It's not just about camping and going outside and breathing in the fresh air and then going inside and writing about it. Sure, that may be a part of it, but it's only a really small part of what outdoor education actually is, or what I interpret it to be. And one of the biggest takeaways I had from this class was not learning about trees and camping and starting a fire, even though we did actually get to do that. What I took away from it the most was learning about treaty ed and what the land meant to Indigenous people and how the Indigenous people used the land and what they did on the land, and then how it was taken away from them, and the questions I'm still left with. Um, like what we're doing now. Is it enough? What more can we do? And I'm not going to tell you about how much I know about the land and about camping and all of that because I was a scout. But since you asked, I was a scout, so I'm just going to tell you about my experience in scouts. So that's me as a scout in Beavers, actually. So there's like three steps. First, you're a Beaver, then you're a Cub, and then you're a Scout. So that's me when I was maybe 5 or 6. And I was in Scouts for close to 10 years, and I have lots of good memories of being in the program and having fires and going on camping trips and setting up tents. But looking back, we never learned about where we were camping or where we were starting the fire or what we were doing on the land. And it ended up being a huge part looking back at it because most of our camps took place in the Capel Valley, either at High Hills, which is just outside Lumsden, Gilwell, which is on Echo Lake, and Lutherland, which is actually a church camp, but it's located on Pasco Lake. All of these camps and 10 years of camping at these same locations, same spots, and not once did we talk about treaties or Indigenous people or the significance of the land. It was just never brought up, and nobody ever wanted to talk about it. Anyway, that's me sitting by the fire right there. I also have a super cool dad who is really supportive of the scouts. So that's me and him. He was a scout leader, and I'm not embarrassed by him in this picture. I'm just tired of not sleeping for 5 days. So I did actually get to have a little conk on the ride home. So that was nice. We have all of these we have all of these provincial parks and municipal parks and national parks, and they're all there to serve a purpose, and not a lot of people really know what they're meant for. They're preserves. They're animal and land preserves. They're meant to be wild and untamed and basically untouched by humans and the civilization and colonization. And you're seeing less and less of it. You're starting to see people tearing down these beautiful landscapes and building on the edges of rivers so that they can put up Walmarts and huge shopping centers like this one. But what about all of this land that's just outside Regina that's completely untouched and there's no buildings on it? Well, sure, that's true, but it's still touched. You're still farming. There's animals that are being held captive on these lands, not necessarily captive if you're not really into that, but they're being farmed and they're being raised on these lands and they're not being free. And you see something like this, and sure, it's beautiful and it looks like nature, which it is, but there's still a farmer driving by on a tractor and it's still being manicured and it's not wild nature and it's not the way that we intended nature to be. So I had the honor of attending Treaty Ed Camp this year. It's the first time I've ever heard of it, and to be completely honest, I wasn't excited for it. It was gonna take up my Saturday, and I didn't want to go at all. But that Saturday morning, I got up early, and I went to the pipe ceremony with Noel Star Blanket. And it was honestly the most amazing experience I've ever had. He taught us about forgiveness and indigenous culture and what the land meant to his people and how they used the land, and basically answered all of my questions, or at least most of them, to the best of his ability. And then that afternoon in the seminar portion, um, we talked. The first speaker, she got up there and she was just as amazing. She talked about how people in Saskatchewan know what treaty education is, what the treaties are, and how everyone here has it all figured out, but it's not true. It wasn't until this last class that I learned about the treaty map. As far as I knew, treaties were only in Saskatchewan, and there's Treaty 4, and I think that's the only thing I knew about. And that's because I went there on a field trip. So we don't have it all figured out here. We learn about residential schools, and that's it. We all saw this picture in school. We all saw this picture, and we both saw these, but nobody ever really talked about how we got here and how it really happened. And if we do, we talk about how the settlers and natives were friends and they worked together and lived happily ever after, and that's it. And to me, that's a waste of a social studies class. But teachers keep teaching the same things to keep it lighthearted and contained so students don't have to learn about a different culture that settlers oppressed and treated very poorly. Because if you showed and explained a picture like this in a social studies class, then you have to deal with the angry parent. And if you didn't catch what that picture was completely, it was a man handing a smallpox blanket to an Indigenous woman and her baby. And that was something that I didn't know about until this class either. Um, so parents assume the second you start talking about Indigenous culture, you're going to warp the minds of students by telling them about residential schools, but that's not the case. I believe it needs to be taught, and there are ways to do it that aren't so harsh. And that's what I love about outdoor education and what I want to incorporate into my classroom. We can go outside. Sure, we can go talk about residential schools, or sure, we can go to an old residential school. But that's not necessarily what we have to talk about and what the students need to be learning about when talking about treaty education and Indigenous culture. Because I learned more about Indigenous people in this class than I have in 12 years of taking social studies. I got to learn about their ideology and how they feel about the land and what it means to them. We learned about treaties and that settlers didn't quite hold up their end of the treaties, but I got to see a culture in a whole new way, a way I never thought of. I got to learn new ways to teach through Indigenous teaching practices, about how a potluck can somehow be relatable to Indigenous culture, which I never thought of before. So, thumbs up, Audrey. And the reason Indigenous culture, treaty ed, and residential schools has been the highlight of this video is because it was the highlight of the class, for me at least. Because learning all of this has been something that I'm going to take away. And it's not anything that could be taught in another class, or at least not as deeply, and not something that I could be as passionate about as I am right now talking to you about it. So I am so grateful for this experience, and I'm glad I got to share some of my ideas and thoughts with you. Thank you very much.